It's that time of year again, isn't it, everyone? Where we are encouraged to have soup, to celebrate the harvest, to enjoy pumpkin spice latte. But actually, really, the best part of this time is to share ghost stories gathered around a fire pit, perhaps with family and friends. So this is what we're going to do today. And it's called But We Want Road Ghosts. And it kind of grew out of a presentation that I gave very recently to the Association of the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena, of which I'm one of the directors. It was a night where we were encouraged to share two different sets of road ghost stories, a section from Caroline McKendrick Gibson centred on the Cornwall area, the Somerset, the Devon space. And I was encouraged to talk about road ghosts of Nottinghamshire, of the East Midlands. So let's get into this, shall we? But We Want Road Ghosts, as it was entitled. So ghostly hitchhiker legends, also known as the vanishing hitchhiker, are a staple of global folklore. They have roots going back centuries, but they did peak in the 20th century with the rise of automobiles and cars and so on. And these tales typically involve a driver picking up a hitchhiker, often as a young woman. She vanishes from the vehicle, later revealed to be a ghost of someone who died along the road. And this motif symbolises the blurred line between the living and the dead, warnings about morality, the eerie allure of rural and lonely roads. A foggy English country road at dusk, a narrow lane lined with hedgerows and golden fields fading into the mist as the night descends closer and closer as the clocks move. So let's talk about road ghosts, shall we? And take you through our presentation. So I was inspired, really. Now, can you imagine getting a thumbs up from a lady like this made of porcelain? But I'd like to talk to you about something that happened very, very recently, and why it was prevalent to my presentation. Recently, I attended Parameet. There was a speaker there from Nottingham who gave a passionate and emotive presentation about a Nottinghamshire road ghost. But it contained elements of three different accounts, of which all I'm very familiar with, and also an embellished conspiracy claim. Thankfully, she was receptive to the origins of the three separate stories and acknowledged this in her enthusiasm that she had combined them. But this is interesting because it talks about how folklore is developed, how narratives build. When layers of stories are interweaved with others, it creates whole new accounts. So I'd actually like to go into those accounts and pull from the original sources. So let's talk about Jenny Burton. As you can see on the screen here, Jenny Burton's Hill. Now, it was so named because of its proximity to the venerable old lady's cottage. Its earlier name was Broomhill. So we're going to go into the story of Jenny Burton. Now, let's talk about the geography of this particular place first. As you can see, as you go up this long road that extends north to south on this particular map is Nottingham Road. And those receptive will notice the Bowman pub at the bottom, and there's a road there called Jenny Burton Way. And up a bit further on the left-hand side, you'll see Broomhill Road. Well, this entire space, as you can see there is a school located there now. That entire area was once Broomhill. There was a number of cottages, a number of properties that were upon there, one of which was owned by the lady Jenny Burton, or Jane Burton, and was her original name. The sources of these clips and quotes here come from Not's history. At this time, or shortly after, Jenny Burton. So in 1920, she was a tenant paying £20 per year for land, cottage and outbuildings which had been erected many years previously by her ancestors. This accompanying sketch was sketched by a wandering artist, unobserved by the old lady herself. That isn't true. We do have the name of that particular artist. So let's dive into the story of Jenny Burton. At this time, or shortly after, she moved to Hucknall Torkard, as her first child Joseph was born there in the summer of 1781. She then produced a further 7 children at a very regular rate. The intervals in between were pretty consistent. So 1784 to 1797, her own husband Joseph, he was a cottager, but he died aged 49 in 1808. And then Jenny lived as a widow in the area. And as it says there, in 1820, Jane, the widow, was a tenant on the charity estate at Broomhill. She was paying £20 a year for land, the cottage and the outbuildings that had been erected previously by her own ancestors. And on the 15th of April 1846, J. Simpson, the artist, he was a wandering artist, he sketched her unobserved. while Mr. James Widdowson attracted her attention in conversation. I'm going to picture it's quite interesting. It appears that she smokes a clay pipe and also had a dog. She is described as being a strange, eccentric widow, and she lived at the farm cottage on the lodge on Nottingham Road. And she lived there for the remainder of her life. She is something of a local celebrity. She lived to the age of 95 and a half. In the 1841 census, it shows her living at age 85 and living at the last property in Broomhill Lane. She died in December 1847, and the Hucknall Church, a place I've frequented many, many times, it's home to many notable figures, Lord Byron, the poet among them, his daughter Ada Lovelace, whose day was celebrated this particular week in the tech world on Monday. Ben Cornt, the world champion boxer, also hails from the town. But the lady of the time we're talking about, the lady of the hour, Jenny Burton, truly remarkable. If you look at those ages of the list that's available on Not's History, in the section that she's in, everyone appeared to live to their ages of around 90 plus, which is rather interesting because there's a metal sculpture in the relatively nearby, as the crow flies, to Arnold Park, that states the average life expectancy of a person in that particular time in Nottingham was just 20. So these people live remarkably comfortable well into their 90s. That may give insight to their affluence, their diet, and the environment that they were in. And the source of those comes from the Beardsmore history of Hucknall Torkard and Not's history. It's intriguing. I said I went to a particular pub, I went to a meeting, I met a group of people who were given a presentation about this particular lady, and they described her as someone who had the appearance of the typical witch. You know, the hat, the crone's nose and the crone's face, perhaps warts on her hand, and she, for this, had this character that appeared to exude the witch archetype, shall we say. But I hear you saying correctly, but this is about road ghosts. But it's important we talk about these entwined stories. The group, along with the local historians, all cited that she had died in 1874, where she accidentally cut herself with a scythe while chopping grass, which is a gruesome way for a person to die who was still active, clearly, on the farmstead at her grand age. It is said that her silhouette is a figure that appears in the road, the centre of the road, this particular stretch of road here, where a figure appears sometimes with a scythe in hand. Usually it's a cloaked figure. Frightening drivers in the headlights, seemingly appearing and disappearing. Admittedly, there may be an urban legend here, and you know what these are like. They have been many times embellished, but this is not the only ghost in the same space. But the reason I brought together these was to talk about her history and the local accounts. In a 2009 locally produced pamphlet and local newspaper, the Hucknall Torkard Times, that I've got a picture there of that you can see. I found it in the library in Hucknall. It features news clippings and letters of local history. With this, there's the account of David Burton, one indeed of her descendants. And it mentions the story as thus. This is a letter he wrote in this particular issue. She accidentally cut herself with a scythe while chopping grass. But this differs from other bizarre wives' tales that we have heard over the last few years. Members of two Hucknall families, the Challons and the Lowes, are direct descendants of Jenny, and their memories are that the old widow was murdered, strangled to death. More than one person in the family has recalled this, although I can't find any information further to this. However, before this tragedy, it is said that she was involved in an incident on Jenny Burton's Hill, formerly Broomhill, that she was knocked down by a horse and cart. The murder story also is confirmed by a gentleman called Mr. Frank Betts, who lived at Butler's Hill in the 1930s. Mr. Betts recalls that he was always told not to go near Jenny Burton's Hill because there was a ghost. It is haunted by a woman who was murdered, and told if you do go there, the ghost will get you. Another old Hucknall resident, a Mrs. Ethel Winterburn, who remembers how she was told to stay away from Jenny Burton's Hill as a child because the ghost of a woman who had hanged herself. Ethel's great-grandma cited the story as saying she used to tell her that a young woman had hanged herself from a tree by the roadside in the 19th century, and she did this because her boyfriend had jilted her. These stories are typical. They have probably been passed down from generation to generation. They sound unlikely, if they are not true, of how and why they originated, but these all add to the mystery of the ghost at Jenny Burton Hill. On the website The Paranormal Database, a really useful source of account, there's this particular mention here: Hucknall, Nottingham Road, in the area known as Jenny Burton's Hill, a haunting manifestation. The date and time is also recorded as the 5th of October 1986 at 22:45. After driving his car into a woman dressed in black clothing from the 1950s, Brian Tweedy stopped, fearing he had killed a pedestrian. Looking around the area, he could find no sign of the woman, and his car had suffered no damage. And Tweedy also claims that the cars ahead and behind him had also claimed to have hit a figure standing in the road, and they had come to a stop at the scene as well. They had all had experiences of hitting and striking an individual. Remarkable. So this is the story of Jenny Burton. George's Lane is a winding route, unlit, with eerie trees that arch over the road that extends to the village town of Calverton in the northeast of the city, home to a number of reports of spooky goings-on. Of the reports that I can locate, it's a mysterious figure in a black robe that has been seen on several occasions since the 1930s. With a hood masking the face except for a large hooked nose, it has spooked those who are out well going towards midnight. The figure chased a gentleman called Mr. Lawrence Bardale for some distance, who then fell ill for several days afterwards, that he has attributed to the case of the chasing ghost. In 1977, there are reports of eerie hanging mists, black mists that moved across the road, as well as swirling black vapour that was reported to officials. Now, country roads are prone to thick patches of fog, so perhaps not paranormal at all. In 1992, villagers Bill and Alison saw a pair of legs, that's right, just a pair of legs, mind, clad in white riding breeches, running across the road. Now, white trousers running across the road, it seems this might have been the first identification of the Nottingham Nightcrawler before I made my documentary. It is, however, attributed to perhaps being a misidentification. A duck, a swan, a nightcrawler. This happens to have occurred, though, on a bus travelling at a speed that was coming along the road. Now, the black figure, the one that is the most widely reported in this particular space. It is said, although no one has confirmed it to me personally, that taxi drivers would avoid using this road. There are a number of apparent claims. It's a black cloaked figure. It appears in the back seat of the car when looking in the rearview mirror, only for them to look around to find no one's there. It's not a safe decision, of course, to take your eyes off the road when you're on a winding, unlit, fast-moving route. But it is. It's one of those tales where it appears that everyone knows someone who's had an encounter, but no one is the person who had the encounter. Very interesting. But Paranormal Investigations East Midlands, comprised of Sean Mark Simpson, Mark Butch and me, visited the location, and they did a number of runs of the road, and they discovered two interesting aspects that are definitely worth considering our ghost encounters along here. They freaked out because they actually thought they had seen a ghost. They had to stop. They had to move around the individual. And when they got out, they realised it was a vagabond, a homeless person, who was actually living in the hedgerow in a small encampment. They stopped the guy. They had to go up to him, talk to him. In fact, I was told they actually poked him just to see if he was real. There's also the identification of what is dubbed the visual matrix phenomena. As you can see there, we've got the road sign there, the arrows that bend around the corners, those black and white arrows there, indicating sharp turns. Now, if the eyes are tracking the board as you turn your head and move, it looks like it's animation frames of a tall black figure. So do these play into the case of the figures on George's Lane? Maybe. Now, this is the story that the lady was very emotive about. This is the story that had affected the lady who was the speaker at Paramine. Now, local folklore and the occasional newspaper reports describe the sightings of a ghostly female figure along the A60, with some drivers swerving to avoid her, only to watch her dematerialise or vanish quickly and entirely. Sometimes it's just a fleeting glimpse. Is it across time, perhaps? Now, the stone memorial here, as you can see, stands as a bit of a sombre testament, erected in the memory of Elizabeth Sheppard of Papelwick. She was murdered on the spot by Charles Rotherham on the 7th of July, 1817, at the age of 17. And it's a tragic tale that unfolds. Elizabeth was seeking employment in Mansfield and had walked from Papelwick, which actually is quite a considerable distance. She was dressed in new shoes. She was carrying a brightly coloured cotton umbrella. She was seen last leaving Mansfield at 6 p.m. after she had spent the afternoon with an individual, but she never returned home. The following morning, her body was found in a roadside ditch. Her skull was brutally smashed, with a bloodied hedge stake lying nearby. The same day, Charles Rotherham, who was a veteran, he was found to have come from Sheffield, and he had been drinking at the Hut Tavern in Newstead shortly after the murder. It's believed that Elizabeth and he crossed paths at an unfortunate moment, and Rotherham, took advantage of the situation. He searched the body for money but found none. He took her shoes and an umbrella instead, and that night he attempted to sell them at the Three Crowns in Redhill, but finding no buyers, he did leave the shoes there. While the umbrella was later sold in the village of Bunny, south of the city, he was arrested in Loughborough, and Rotherham confessed fully, offering no motive apart from the desperate need for money. And on July 25th, 1817, Charles was hanged at Gallows Hill. But sympathy for Elizabeth had surged. It prompted local Mansfield businessmen to fund a collective, a memorial for this young lady. A rare stone that depicts not only the victim, but and the murderer. It states them in stone. Now, some speculate, as this lady did who I spoke to, that this may have been a deliberate distraction, perhaps used to obscure other motives. One book and the presentation suggest that Elizabeth may well have been pregnant, perhaps seeking support, and was killed with the blame shifted to Rotherham and then set in stone. Maybe he was hired to commit the act. However, I don't lean that way. I lean more towards Occam's razor. His confession and his lack of funds offer a simple, optimistic crime. The road has been widened a number of times, and the memorial stone has been relocated accordingly. The disturbance is said to have unsettled Elizabeth's spirit, leading to her reported appearances. Now, ghost hunting groups are seizing upon this opportunity, and they perhaps have done for some time. They visit the stone with the intention to nudge it, to move it, in their hopes of creating a spectral encounter. But we have an anniversary haunting here, a phantom road ghost, her apparition seemingly triggered by efforts to provoke her presence. Now, Richard Morley wrote an account on the Our Local Mansfield website that is very relevant to this case. Back in 1987, I started to restore the memorial. I found that there were actually 3 stones in all, a footing stone, a base stone, and the memorial with the inscription. I believe this memorial is still in its original position, despite the rumours of it being moved back during the road widening. And the reason why I assume this is because I have black and white photos showing its position before these roadworks took place. I worked a sunken slate panel into the face and re-lettered the inscription onto it, simply to ensure that it is readable for many years to come. And every year I maintain the stone. In February 2017, I fixed an ornament on the top, as early reports suggested there was an ornament placed on the top of the stone when it was first erected. However, it went missing before any photograph could have been captured of what it looked like, so I designed my own. Now, at the beginning, aged 20, I knew nothing of stonemasonry until I read the sad tale of Bessie Sheppard in a book, and on visiting the stone for the first time, I had an overpowering urge to take up masonry and restore the stone as it was in poor condition at the time. And I intend to maintain the stone for as long as possible, and that was from 1987. So, whether this gentleman is still looking after that stone, I don't know. I do believe there's a bit of a community effort that goes on to keep this stone clean. I do believe there's actually the plaque that he's spoken about on there, the slate panel that is on the front that keeps that clean. So these were the 3 stories that this particular lady had sort of amalgamated together. Elements of all 3 of those were in her telling of the story of Bessie Sheppard along the A60, which is the road between Nottingham and Mansfield. But before we move on, I'd like to share a couple of other stories that I think would grab your attention quite well. I'd like to include an account of author David Haslam, who's one of his books I have right here. This is The Ghost of Legends of Nottinghamshire. Actually a very well wrote book. Lots of first-hand accounts in here. But the account I'm going to talk about is from a GeoCities website, which means it's no longer online. They've been amalgamated into Yahoo, and those pages no longer exist. It is cited by the BBC, however. And the story is thus. It's called The Menace on the Roof, The Highway Maniac. And I wanted to make sure that it is recorded for posterity's purposes. A coach was travelling along the Great North Road when a young married couple were aboard. Midway between towns, the coach lost a wheel, and the coachman decided to walk on to the next stop to summon help. Now, the couple inside were quite happy to be left alone at first. Darkness began to fall, and the night grew cold. Impatient of the long delay, and fearing his new wife would get a chill, the husband decided to walk up a little way, up the road himself, and watch for the coachman, whilst there was still light of the day. The lady sat alone, keeping warm as best she could. And after some time she became anxious to her husband's return. The inky darkness was beginning to sink into her. It was perpetuating all around. But she was soon assured when she heard voices approaching. Her relief turned to alarm as she heard shouts and the sounds of running men. Someone had jumped on the roof of the coach, and it began to sway alarmingly. And then loud thumps above threatened to bring the roof down upon her. She scrambled to the window, and she was dazed by the light of many lamps. And she shaded her eyes with her arm. And a voice that came from the crowd called to her, "Miss, you must open the door slowly and walk towards the light. On no account look behind you." Trembling, she opened the door, and on unsteady legs walked towards the silent lamp-bearers. But then she did turn to look at what was on the roof of the coach, and there, on the roof, caught by lamplight, crouched a man whose figures were horribly twisted with rage, and his eyes were that of wild, red, unseeing eyes only of a raving lunatic. As she watched, the snapping chains from manacles on his wrists were flaying about him as he was holding her husband's severed head and was banging it on the roof of the coach. There are many modern versions of this story, such as a car that has run out of petrol, but the story remains the same. And our concluding tale today is one I learned of last week. Last week I visited a veteran researcher, Anthony James, and I uncovered a remarkable account of somewhere that's really, really close to me. In fact, not even 2 minutes walk from here. Now, he is a former postal worker of over 20 years serving our local community. Anthony regularly delivered to Hempshill House, this particular residence here. It was once a grand residence. It's been there since the 1400s, but it's been reduced to repair. And there he met an elderly occupant, nearing 100, and her son. Curiosity led him to ask about, is there any hauntings, any ghosts? And her face lit up with an eagerness to share, and she recounted 2 eerie encounters along the road to the hall. Now, overtaken by the A610 and new developments, late one evening, when closing the gates, she heard the clatter of hooves and the rumble of wooden wheels on gravel. A regal black carriage, pulled by 2 muscular black horses with lanterns casting lights, thundered towards her, and it ran through the gates. She could not close them in time, and it pulled up to the front of the house. An imposing, tall figure with long black 2-pointed riding coat with fastenings descended backwards from the rider's bench, their head not present. It was as if it was just clothing. The scene vanished moments later as she assessed what was occurring in front of her. It stayed with her. Then 6 years later, as circumstances were seemingly the same, she was closing the gate one evening, and the galloping horses returned, pulling the ornate carriage closer to the house. This time the lanterns were richer, the light illuminated the scene much brighter, and the headless rider descended once again, crunching non-existent gravel. As she approached, the vision faded once more, and Anthony, animated in her vivid telling to him, cherished these visits until her passing just 5 weeks later. Her son moved away, and the house was then left to ruin. And in 2005, a historian called Richard Hunt and his wife Felicity, sympathetic new owners, embarked on a multi-year restoration, and they've been having a a blog, effectively, seeing it change from this debris-filled house into something that's back to its structure and the way that it looked in the 1400s, which is far older than they actually thought it was. And this concludes our accounts of stories and road ghosts of Nottingham. There is many, many more, of course, but this was the presentation I gave to ASSAP. So thank you very much for joining me here today. It is, of course, October. Enjoy your Halloween, and this quarter of the year, be sure to gather with friends and family and tell stories around firelight. Until next time.